Hi, my name is Sean McIntosh, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today for this webinar on the recent changes to Microsoft Windows Server 2016 licensing. These changes may have the potential to have a significant impact on your Microsoft licensing costs, and hopefully this is timely given that it's true-up season for many folks. Our presentation today will delve into what these changes are and how you can be proactive in terms of preventing cost increases. Our presenter today is Mike Austin. Mike leads the service delivery team at Method 180 and has successfully negotiated billions of dollars in Microsoft contracts over his career. Lines will be muted during the webcast and questions will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation. If you have any questions, please submit them via the chat console and we will do our best to answer them either during or at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available for encore viewing at method180.com. Mike, I'll turn things over to you to get started.
Great, thanks, Sean. So I'll just start a little bit for those of you that are new, that haven't attended one of our webinars, just give you a little bit of a background about Method 180. I'll keep this short, but we're a small consulting organization that helps organizations drive costs out of contracting with Microsoft and other software vendors. Actually, we've added a few others like IBM and SAP and Oracle to our portfolio in the last little while, but we primarily engage with clients around three different areas. One is around negotiating contracts and driving costs out of those contracts, whether those are, EA renewals or large purchases that you're making. We have an audit assistance program where we help you defend in an audit if you are being audited by Microsoft or others. We also do self-assessments under that same sort of category. So if you're an organization that's trying to understand where you do sit to be proactive, we can help you through that. And then we offer some other kind of services around retainers and things like that for some of our clients as well. So today we're here to talk about Windows 2016 server licensing and the changes from processors to cores and sort of how that impacts you. And so really what I want to try and do is get across a few main points today. One is just to give you an understanding of the new core licensing model. It's similar to SQL's core model, but it is different, and so there are some nuances that we'll go through on that. The other thing that I want to give you an understanding of is that Microsoft, when they launched this, positioned it as basically revenue neutral, and I think they sort of looked at it and said, based on their conversion rates that they were giving you, basically 16 cores per server, that very few servers out there had greater than 16 cores, and it shouldn't impact people, but that's actually not what we're seeing in the practice. We're seeing price increases anywhere between 15 and 25%. We had one that was substantially more than that as well. So this is a price or was, I guess, when they launched it, I call it a price increase in disguise. We'll talk a little bit about the differences between licensing physical and virtual servers, and then I do want to spend a little bit of time around how to build a process to validate if you're looking at a price increase, how to assign licenses and those sorts of things. So we're going to actually open up a server worksheet that we use here, and I'm going to kind of walk you through and talk a little bit about that. Also going to go through a little bit of the history of Windows Server licensing and kind of talk through some of the key licensing concepts and tools, and a little bit about, the key concepts and terms of Windows licensing, and then talk a little bit about tools. I do have a little bit of a tease in here today as well on Azure and sort of some of the concepts of Windows licensing or the Azure hybrid use benefit. Not going to go into a ton of detail on that one today. A little bit of a tease that our next webinar is actually going to be an Azure 101 licensing. So if you do have that, we will be going more into depth, but I am going to touch on it because it is an important concept, and it's something that we're seeing more and more clients be interested in and requiring help with. So that's kind of what we're going to try and get out of the webinar this afternoon here. What I really hope you can do with this is that you can understand some, take and figure out, if you are facing a price increase, what does that look like? Start to give you the knowledge to, I always believe that knowledge is power with Microsoft. Are they going to decrease your cost because they've had a licensing change? No, but when you use that as an overall part of a negotiation strategy, the more knowledge you have, the better. So we're going to talk about, having a way to look at how you can reset your licenses to optimize them, how to look at those, understanding, the new licensing rules and how they may apply to you. Some of you on this call, it may be imminent that you're facing that as your contracts are expiring. Others may still be, still have a couple of years plus with the processor licensing models and kind of need to understand what the impact is when they expire. So depending on where you are in your contract cycle with Microsoft, you can be there, you can deal with that. We're going to talk about how to budget more effectively for the renewals. Maybe work with IT counterparts if you're facing some upgrades about maybe some things that they can do depending on the time frame to change some of their configurations. And then we're going to talk about license grants and what those mean, because Microsoft gives you basically 8 cores per processor. Processor licenses were 2 cores, so they're going to grant you 16 cores, but you can get more. And you don't necessarily need software assurance to be renewed to get those, and you don't necessarily need to give Microsoft inventory data to get those. So we're going to talk through that a little bit today as well. I'm going to start here with a little bit of just some basics. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I'm going to assume that this is foundational knowledge, but I do want to talk about a couple of key concepts here. So there's a couple of concepts within Microsoft licensing, and particularly within Windows Server around downgrade rights. So that one I think is fairly standard known. If I have a Windows 2016 server license, I don't have to have a 2016 install. I could have a 2012, I could have a 2008. It gives me that downgrade rights. Now that is what we call a use right. So that's embedded into the license. And I apologize if I'm pausing a little bit. I've got a bit of a cold, so I'm just putting myself on mute to cough so that we don't have to hear that on the call. But that's what we call embedded use right within the license, so a downgrade right. There's also the concept of a down addition right, whereas if I have a Windows data center license, I can use that license to actually license a Windows standard instance. Probably not the most cost-effective thing to do, but if I had some extra data center licenses and was short on standard, I could apply that. And then obviously there's a concept of a version upgrade. In the Microsoft world, you either need to have software assurance to get that version upgrade, or you purchase a new license. So those are the real key concepts. So I guess there's also the concept of step up, where if I have a standard license and I no longer need that to be standard, I want to step that up to a data center, I can step that up to a data center. But the key thing here is, what I always like to talk about is what's embedded rights within a license. Those are those use rights, downgrades and down additions. And then what is a license itself? That's to get to the new version or step up. So those are the key concepts that I think are just important to sort of understand. And the reason that I bring this up is when it comes to licensing and when you're looking at your deployments, you have to license to the highest edition and the highest version, okay? And so what I mean by that, and I'll get into virtualization rules and things like that in a little bit here, but if I've got a host server that has 5 VMs on it, and one of those is 2016, I can't use a 2012 license to license that 2016. So I got to look and say, okay, what's the highest edition, 2016? What's the highest version? Is it data center, standard, maybe even enterprise if you're got some older 2008 servers out there. And so you really have to look at those licenses to figure out, okay, how can I license that? So if I was doing data center to get unlimited virtualization, I'd have to have a 2016 data center license. If I was stacking, I may be able to stack some 2012 and 2016. We'll talk about stacking here in a little bit. The other key concept to understand is that I've talked about this on a lot of my webinars, but it is a key concept within Microsoft licensing, which is the reassignment rule, and then what the Microsoft calls the 90-day rule. And so the basic gist of this is I'm allowed to transfer a license to another device as long, or user, I guess if it was a user-based license, but since we're talking servers here, it's going to be a device. But I'm allowed to transfer that license to another device, but I can only do that once in a 90-day period. So they don't, basically what Microsoft doesn't want is what we call short-term license reassignment. So if I take a license and let's just say I apply it from physical box 1 to physical box 2, the license goes from 1 to 2, and it stays now with 2 for 90 days. I can't take it off of 2 and reapply it back to 1 until 90 days is up. Now, if 2 has a catastrophic failure and we decommission it or something like that, you can free it up for those purposes, but you can't free it up just to sort of float your licenses, so to speak. So there is a concept within Microsoft licensing that's embedded in software assurance called server mobility. And what server mobility is so if you think about in a virtualized world, if I have a host, host 1 and host 2, I have one VM. And that VM moves from host 1 to host 2 with this 90-day rule, the license can go with it. And then if it moves back to host 1, the license is stuck on host 2 for 90 days. What server mobility is, it overrides the 90-day rule and says you can move that VM as many times as you possibly want without, without violating the 90-day rule. It overrides it. The problem is Windows Server does not offer server mobility. SQL Server does, but Windows Server does not. So that whole concept of server mobility and allowing my licenses to float as my VMs potentially move across different hosts doesn't exist in the Windows world, and so that becomes a little bit of a challenge depending on how you're managing your licenses. Now, what Microsoft has done is they've embedded a right into software assurance for Windows servers to move into the Azure cloud environment, which they call the Azure hybrid use benefit. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit later. But that's the only sort of mobility feature that Windows has, unlike a bunch of the other server licenses like Exchange and SQL and others that allow you to move to other cloud providers, allow you to, override the 90-day rule. So I'm not going to touch much on software assurance. I think most of you should understand that concept, but why would you buy software assurance on Windows servers? Because a lot of what we see is people put software assurance on Windows servers, and we don't actually believe that they take advantage of them to the degree that would actually justify the cost of software assurance. But there's really 3 reasons that you need to buy software assurance, or 3 reasons that you would buy it, I guess. If you plan on upgrading, the break-even point, if you look at the cost of software assurance being 25% of a license cost, is really very simply 4 years. So if I plan to upgrade every 4 years, it makes sense. We don't typically see that. We see servers lasting 6 to 8 years in most large enterprise environments. So some get upgraded in 4, but a lot of them are 6 to 8. The other reason to look at it is there something embedded in the product use rights that would necessitate me having software assurance? With Windows Server, the only one is that Azure hybrid right, because server mobility, although I put it here, is not available for Windows Server. So you have to look and see, okay, is there something embedded in there that I could make use of? Maybe if I am putting some instances in Azure, it might make sense. But if I'm putting them in AWS, I can't use them, so it doesn't make sense. So it depends on looking at that. And I would say you would not buy software assurance for training vouchers and deployment planning and things like that, although Microsoft would love you to. But the dollar amount that you get back on those things does not justify the cost of software assurance. It's going to be those first 2. Do I upgrade, and is there something embedded in the product use rights that require me to have software assurance? So what changes has Microsoft made since 2012? And again, I think most of you are probably familiar with this, so I'm going to just talk through this a little bit at a high level and touch on this really quickly. In 2012, Microsoft changed from a server to a processor license model. The reason I bring this up is a lot of people have old entitlements of 2008 that were server license, and you could put one server license on an 8-processor server, where in 2012 they changed it to a processor model, 2 processors per license. You would need 4 for that server in that model. They also removed the Windows Enterprise Edition, so they just went to a standard and a data center edition. They increased the pricing. They actually did have a price increase on the licenses back in 2012. And they also changed the virtualization rules. Big one being that an enterprise server license, and if you still have some of these, you can still take advantage of them potentially. So the enterprise server allowed for 4 VMs per license on the host. And so that was one of the biggest changes they made there. In 2012 with R2, when they launched that, they had yet again another price increase. And then they had a new SA benefit that they put on the RDS Cal portion, which is the remote desktop services for terminal server, which allowed you to then use your RDS Cals if they have software assurance in a third-party data center. Again, I put limited value there because unless you're hosting things through, say, like Citrix, like office applications or desktop applications of any size, you're unlikely doing RDS into a third party, but there are some people that do that could get benefit out of it, but I don't think this was a huge gift for Microsoft. And then in 2016, they came along and changed from processors to cores. So the Windows team finally decided to follow SQL and change from processor model to core model. Still require your CALs, obviously. They did add some new features into the data center edition itself. And then they offered a discounted Azure pricing as a new SA benefit. And that's this hybrid Azure thing that we're going to talk about here in a couple of minutes, okay? So what's new in 2016 licensing? A couple of things is now it's core-based licensing. So unlike SQL, where you had 4 core minimums, Windows came out with a 16 core minimum, or 8 cores per processor, where SQL is 4 cores per processor. So of course the two don't align. Those two product groups never seem to want to do what each other does and make things simple for us. So they have a 16 core minimum license requirement per server. Each processor has to have a minimum of 8 cores assigned to it. So even if I have, I don't even know if this is possible, but if I had 4 processors with 4 cores each, it's not 16 cores, I need 32 because they have an 8 core minimum per processor, but a 16 core minimum per server. So if I had a 1 processor, 8 core box, it still needs 16 cores. From a licensing perspective, 16 cores for the most part is equivalent to a 2012 two processor license. And then we've got some special rules that we're going to get into when it comes to hardware virtualization and things of that nature, okay? So when we talk about Server 2016 licenses are assigned to the physical server, okay? And this is important because this applies to your virtual environments as well. So in SQL, for instance, you can apply licenses to your virtual servers. Windows, you cannot. You apply licenses to the physical server itself. With data center, when you get unlimited virtualization, that's pretty simple. You're going to look at the number of core licenses in that host server, buy that number of core licenses, and you get unlimited virtualization. It becomes tricky if you want to use standard on that server. And I'm going to talk about stacking here in a little bit, because you can stack standard licenses to cover your physical boxes. And in a lot of cases, it's actually more cost effective if you can manage through the 90-day rule and no server mobility. But you need to look at it from a physical server machine. So with Windows, the first thing to remember is it's not about the virtual environment. It's all about the physical environment. All licenses assigned to a server must be the same edition. Okay, so this is a little bit of a gotcha that I can't mix standard and data center on the same server. I don't know why you would want to, because if I have data center on a server, I got to go to the number of processors or cores on the physical host, and I get unlimited virtualization anyways. But I think in older rules, some people were looking at it from a VM perspective, and maybe this might have made sense, but you can't mix the license types of the edition, okay? The number of cores licensed for all servers is the greater of the following: the total number of cores on all processors, 16 cores per server, or 8 core licenses per processor. So again, you got to look at it and go the total number of processors times 8. If that's greater than 16, that's what you buy. If the number of cores on a processor is less than 8, you have to use that. So a couple of little nuances there. These things are sold in 2 license packs, core packs, okay? So they do come in 2 core pack licenses. It's interesting. We're seeing a lot of customers now have thousands of Windows Server licenses because of this, but they are sold in 2 core packs. Unlike the SQL Server, although I know they sort of did away with core factors in 2016 with SQL servers, there are no core factors. So it's just the number of physical cores, regardless of if you're using AMD or Intel, unlike SQL, where you may be able to take advantage of some of those core factors to decrease licenses. And obviously, your license costs will increase on servers with more than 8 cores. Because if 8 cores equals the price of one processor, if I've got a 16-core box, my price is going to double for software assurance renewal on that box. And that's why we say it's important to review architecture when buying servers. What we're seeing a lot of people do is, instead of purchasing boxes with more cores now, they're adding more RAM to the server to get more density on them, and they're finding that to be much more cost effective. But I think these are things that the architecture teams need to look at and be aware of, because these licensing costs can get out of hand. We have a client that we're just working with right now, and their Windows data center licenses, they have an average core to processor of over 12, and so their data center licenses have increased by about 25%. And so they did have some things that they'd done all year long, thinking that they were going to decrease their licensing costs by doing some consolidation, getting rid of the number of physical boxes. And they did decrease their standard licenses by almost half, but that 25% price increase on data center equated to about a 10% overall price increase on Windows and System Center for them, because these licensing rules apply to System Center as well. It's not just you can replace Windows to System Center; it's the same thing. And so that's a substantial hit, and it's very difficult to try and forecast and budget that. They thought they were doing all the right things, when what they should have maybe been doing, if they wanted to decrease their license costs, was to focus on consolidating a host, or potentially refreshing some of the hosts that had more cores and things like that, to decrease their licenses there. So I just want to talk a little bit about some Microsoft speak here before we get into virtualization. Microsoft uses the term operating system environment. So that's really your virtual session. That's your VM. So an OSE is a virtual session, a virtual Windows server, so to speak, in this case. A couple of things, your physical hardware. So you're going to be looking at processors and cores in Microsoft world. The hypervisor is irrelevant to Microsoft. Could be VMware, could be Xen, could be Hyper-V. It doesn't really matter to Microsoft. The hypervisor layer is what it is. We get asked all the time whether, if I have VM, can I use data center because I don't actually have a Windows data center installed. The answer is yes. Microsoft doesn't look at it from a hypervisor perspective. You want to look at it from a use rights perspective. So from a 2016, what's the virtualization rules? First and foremost is, if you have a standard edition, you can run one physical OSE and 2 virtual OSEs. So the physical would be if you're using Hyper-V as the hypervisor, or you can run 2 virtual OSEs per licensed server. So again, you have to look at the number of cores and license the number of cores, and then you get that number of, you get 2 VMs. Here's a trick. This is where they kind of catch you, is it's not 2 VMs per 16 cores. So if I have a 64 core box, I have to license 64 cores, and then I get 2 VMs. If I want to stack standard to get to 4 standard VMs on that server, it's 128 cores that I have to license, okay? With data center, the number of OSEs that you can run, or the number of VMs, is unlimited. A key thing to note here is you do not require SA in order to do that. There is, no restriction. There's no requirement to have SA to get the unlimited thing here. So for license reassignment, the 90-day is in full effect. There's no way to override that. For third-party hosted servers, the only way that you can really do this is on dedicated hardware. I know that's not what the slide says, but that's basically the only way you can do it. Inside of anybody outside of Azure, you can't really use your licenses unless you have dedicated hardware. And so that's dedicated physical servers to your company. It can't be a multi-tenant environment, basically. So I was talking about the concept of stacking. I'm going to touch on this here again in a couple of seconds, but I want to talk about this again. So I just want to use a simple example. I've got one server, it's got 16 cores, and it's got 4 VMs on it. And so I could buy 16 cores of data center. That gives me unlimited VMs, so I cover all 4. Or I could buy 16 cores, get 2 VMs, stack another 16 cores, get another 2 VMs, and have 4 VMs. So I can buy 32 cores of standard in that case, or 16 cores of data center. And that actually allows me to run those 4 VMs. So the 90-day, so I just got a question on why is the 90-day reassignment rule preventative to stacking standard? So it isn't preventative. You can still do it. The reason that I kind of make that comment is it can be difficult potentially to manage that, right? Because if I'm stacking and VMs are moving, the licenses potentially have to go with them, and then they get stuck on those servers. Now, that's not always the case. There are ways around it. You just need to make sure you have that visibility, and I'm actually going to talk about that in a couple of seconds. But you know, the reason that we say stacking licenses as standard is kind of the 90-day rule makes that difficult is because you have to watch and see where those VMs are going and how often they're moving to figure out, do I need more licenses on that server? Now, what we're finding and what we see in practice is if you've got a buffer of somewhere between 10 and 20%, depending on how often your VMs move, of standard licenses, you can stack without an issue. You'd be able to prove it. Now, Microsoft doesn't like that in an audit. It is some work to prove it to them, but there are ways using RV tools to see how often VMs are moving, and you can actually prove it. So it's not that it's preventative. It's just it means that there's a little bit more work to monitor to make sure you stay within compliance. So how many licenses are needed? So let's just take a couple of examples here. If I've got a 1 processor server and it's got 2 cores per processor, I need 16 core minimum, so I need 8 licenses. This one here, actually, this is a chart that came out of Microsoft. It's a 10 core processor. I still need 16 because it's a 1 processor server. Whereas because if I go to a 2 processor, 10 core server, I need 20 cores or 10 2-packs. Okay, so again, this is just showing you that what you need to do is look at the number of processors. Here, you know, these ones are all below 8, so you'll see in this one where it's 4 processors, 4 times 8, 32 is the minimum, or 62 licenses. And this one, because it's 4 processors times 10 cores, it's greater than 8, it's 40 processors or 20 licenses. Okay, so again, Microsoft sells these in 2-core packs, so it does get a little bit confusing. Now, here's where we're going to get into the stacking concept a little bit. Okay, so basically what happens, and this is what I was talking about earlier, is you can stack your standard licenses if you have more than 2 VMs, but you have to go back to that physical hardware when you're looking at this from a licensing perspective. Okay, and so what that means is if I look here, I've got 1 proc server with 16 cores. Okay, so I can have 2 VMs with 16 cores. I can have 4 with 32. So if I've got 3 or 4, I actually need to buy 32 cores. If I have 6, I need to buy 48. Okay, because I'm just doing the multiples of 16 here, right? So you just have to just keep going by 16 cores every time you see they jump. So the more VMs you put on those servers, the more you have to stack. So it's back to the fact of back to the hardware. And so what I mean by that is, if we look over here with this server with 32 cores, this is where it really comes to light. Okay, this one it's going up by 16, and I get 2 VMs every time, right? In this server here, it's 4 procs with 32 cores. So I have to buy 32 cores to get 2 VMs. If I want 4, I need 64, right? So it's not 16 cores gives me 2 VMs. It's back to that physical hardware. However many cores are in the physical hardware, I license all those cores, then I get 2 VMs. Okay, then I got a question here. If you license each server in a cluster for the maximum amount of OSEs, then your concern doesn't apply, right? That's correct. So that's how you could get over the stacking if you're doing that from a stacking perspective. If you license to the maximum, you're basically never going to get yourself in a problem. You've got the concept there. Okay, so again, I just want to hit back on this one more time. Is that from a standard perspective, it is the number of cores in the physical box that earns you the rights to 2 VMs. So 32 cores in that physical box, I get 2 VMs for 32 cores. Whereas in this box, it has 16 cores, I get 2 VMs for 16. So the cost to get 16 doubles as you in that scenario. Okay, and so that's what I mean. It's very important to look at the physical server with Windows. It's not 16 cores gives me 2 VMs. So if I got 4 VMs, I just need 32 cores. I have to actually go and look at the physical box to figure out if it's 32 or more. Okay. Now, one of the things when it comes to stacking, when we look at stacking and we look at call it a little bit of a risk assessment on where you sit from a license assignment, because what we want to do is we want to use your cheaper licenses first when you're doing license assignments, so standards over data center. So one of the things what we'll do is if you've got a host server that's not in a cluster, that's a prime candidate to stack without any issues from a compliance perspective, because if it's not clustered, then they don't have any vMotion going on and VMs aren't moving from host to host. So, one of the things we do is we look, see if that host server is in a cluster. Nope. Okay, then we do the math to figure out, okay, how many standard licenses are required versus data center, what's the cost of those, and figure out what's the most cost-effective way to sort of do that, okay? So I'm just going to skip over that slide. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about SA core license grants, okay? So basically what's happening is for every license of Windows Server processor that I have under SA, Microsoft is giving me 16 cores. So they're giving, each of those are 2 processor licenses. They give us 8 cores per processor, so they're going to give us 16 cores or 8 licenses, okay, for every one. So when you're looking at your inventory, if all of your servers are 8 cores or less per processor, you have no issues because the grants themselves are just going to give you enough cores to cover your environment. Now, the reality is, even in some of my smallest clients, that's never the case. They always have more than average 8 cores per processor. And so what you do in order to determine this is you have to scan and document your core counts, okay? And so what that means is you need to use a tool to go out and scan your environment, to look at all your servers, both physical and virtual, and the hosts themselves. Look at the number of processors, look at the number of cores, look at the mappings of host to guest, all that sort of stuff, and document this. Now, Microsoft loves to use their Microsoft Map toolkit to do this. It does a decent job. There are some gotchas in it. We always say don't just turn that raw data over to Microsoft. You should, sanitize it first. But, Map, if you don't have a tool, another tool that does this, works well with some caveats. You can use tools like SCCM and some others to get the host information, definitely get the physical server information. The problem with SCCM and a lot of the other tools out there like Altiris or Flexera, in some cases, a bunch of those other tools, is they don't have the mappings of host to guest VMs, which is very important when you're trying to figure this out. So if you're going to use a tool like that, you may need to offset your information with something else. RV Tools, if you're a VMware customer, that is a reporting feature of vCenter, has the mappings, has the host information. So that in terms of the physical attributes of processors and cores. So you can combine a couple of different ways to get at this. Okay. So if you are in a situation where you have servers where you need greater than 8-to-1 grant, Microsoft will want you to document it. So they're going to ask you for that deployment data. And so we're always hesitant to do that because they take that stuff, make all kinds of assumptions, and come back and tell you them all kinds of money on true-ups that isn't true. And then you end up spending all this time fighting them, which is not productive. So you can just try, if you're coming up for renewal, to ask for a grant. So that client that I was talking about earlier, that was slightly over 12, we went back to Microsoft and asked for a 14-to-1 grant. They pushed back, a few times, but eventually just said, okay, we'll give you 14-to-1, and we didn't have to provide the deployment data. Other clients that we've worked with where we know the deployment data, we've built their deployment positions, we've just turned over the information to Microsoft because we know it can't get in trouble when it's presented properly, and they've given it that way. Now, one of the questions I get asked quite often is, if I don't renew my software assurance, do I still get the grants? The answer is yes, if you've documented it. Now, the problem with that is, because I'm not renewing SA, let's just use a simple example. I've got one server that's got 24 cores, and so I need 24, not 16. I document that, I keep that document, but it's just kind of my inventory that says I now have 24 core licenses. There's nowhere that gets tracked in Microsoft's licensing. If I renew those cores and get SA, then I get 24 cores of SA or 12 licenses. But if I don't renew, there's nothing there. So I actually have to keep those server deployment stuff forever, basically, in order to prove that I, was entitled to a greater grant. So if you're not going to renew SA, we always position that you should go to Microsoft and ask for an amendment that Microsoft agrees that you had that, and get it at least documented that way, so you have some sort of record. In some cases, it does make sense to do some upgrades if you got some if you still have processors on your agreement prior to the cores, depending on what you're doing. So you definitely want to look at potentially doing true ups on processors, maybe even truing up some more than you actually had to avoid some of this in the future. But that's a little bit of analysis that is client by client that you need to do. Like I said, one of the things that some of our more proactive clients are doing is they're actually starting to look at their host servers to figure out, should they accelerate some hardware upgrades? Should they throw some more RAM on some of their servers and, consolidate some more VMs on? And so I suggest you start looking at those things if you have time, and then, obviously document your grants and get an upgrade plan. So what I want to talk about next is just licensing Windows in Azure. Like I said, this is just a little bit of a sneak peek. Our next webinar I'm going to do is all on Azure licensing, because it is kind of very complex, and I'm just going to touch a real high level here, a couple of the concepts, but in the next one we're going to go really deep into how Azure licensing works, what is monetary commit versus what you're actually buying, how can you make that work for you, how do you actually save money on unit consumptions of products and things like that. But for now, what I wanted to touch on is the Azure hybrid use benefit, because Microsoft is pushing this big. We're seeing it everywhere. And what the Azure hybrid use benefit is it allows you to utilize your licenses as long as they have software assurance on them to offset the cost of Windows Server licensing in Azure. It's only for Azure. Okay, so if you're AWS, this benefit doesn't work. It's only in Azure. And what Microsoft has done is they've, in essence, priced a compute instance with Windows Server at about 40% less than if you were buying the Windows license from Microsoft. Okay, because what they've done is they basically said, if you're using this Azure hybrid use benefit, we're going to allow you to purchase the compute for that at the price of a Linux server, which is about 40% less than a Windows server. Now, that 40% is very generic because Azure has different sizes of VMs that you can purchase, and so the 40% is going to vary, across. If I'm using a 1-core, 4 GB VM versus 32 cores, 156 gigs or whatever. So it varies, but that's kind of the rule of thumb. Okay. There are different rules here for data center and for standard licenses. Okay, so one of the key concepts with data center is you can use your license to license both a host server on premise and to license VMs in Azure. Okay, so that's where the hybrid comes in. I can license both my data center and my own physical. I use that data center license to license a host server and my own physical data center, or I can use, and I can use that in Azure. Okay, so I get both. Whereas with standard, it can only be used in one or the other. So if I assign the standard license with SA to a server in my physical data center, my own data center, I cannot use it in Azure. Okay, but if I assigned a license to a physical server or physical host in my data center, I can use it there and in Azure with that data center license. Okay, so I know that's a little little complicated, but with data center, I get both. I can get the unlimited virtualization on my host server, and I get the Azure VMs. With standard, I can only use it in one or the other. And the 90-day rule still applies here. So if I assign a license to Azure, it's there for 90 days. I can't bring it back. Okay. Now, what do I get with the Azure hybrid benefit? For every 16 cores that you have with SA, you get up to 2 virtual machines of 8 cores or 1 virtual machine with 16 cores. Okay, so this is different than stacking. They just look at it and say for every 16 cores, you either get 2 VMs of 8 or 1 of 16. If I have a 32 core VM in Azure, I need to have 32 cores with SA assigned to it. So the stacking concept is still there, but it's not the same as stacking in your environment where I have to look at the physical hardware. And if it's got 64 cores, I need 64 to get my 2 VMs. Here it's just every 16 cores give you 2 VMs. The other concept here is data center only gives you either 2 8-core VMs or 1 16-core VM, not unlimited like on-premise. Okay, so with Azure, data center licenses, although you get the 2, we'll call it 2 VMs, it's very expensive to utilize data center in Azure if you're going to license your VMs. And on the next webinar, I'm going to go through that. I put a note here as well is that you need to deploy the server differently in Azure in order to take advantage of this. So there's a whole process that your IT team needs to go through to install the image differently so that it can take advantage of this. And that's well documented out there, but you can't just go into the Azure portal and provision a Windows server, because if you do, it'll charge you for the full pop with the Windows licenses. There's a special way that they have to image those in order to take advantage of it. You can take your own image in with this as well, but there's a script that you need to use in order to do that. So there is a little bit of, what's the word I want to use here? There's a little bit of technical requirement in order to make sure that the portal knows that you're taking advantage of this benefit. Okay. So I just wanted to show you a couple real quick examples. Basically, an A1 instance, that's just the name of the instance. It comes with a 1 core, 1.7 gigabytes of RAM, 70 gigabytes of disk, and the US West data center. If I'm buying that with a Windows license, I'm paying about 10 cents or 11 cents per hour. If I'm buying it without, I'm paying about 7 cents an hour. So if we just assume that that runs 24/7 by 365, for Windows, it's $1,000 a year or 950. For Linux, it's 640, or without the Windows. I put Linux there, but it's without Windows license. So the cost of the Windows license there is about $315 a year. Now, this is standard rack rate. Enterprise customers are going to get some discounts, so the cost of that license goes down when you get discounts for being enterprise clients. But this is just kind of, if I actually went and did it, this is what I would pay. And I also did one here on an A7 instance, so it's just a bigger one with 8 cores, some more RAM and disk. You can just see that in that case it's $14,000 for the year versus $10,600, which the cost of the Windows license is about $3,400. So a couple of things to note with this one: you could run 2 A1 instances with 1 license because that's less than 16 cores, right? So, and I guess the same with this A7 as well. You can run 2 of those because it's less than 16 cores. It's one 8 core. But just for standard comparison, level A is if you got to buy a net new license of LNSA, it's $421. You can see that's less. And if you're buying SA only, it's more cost advantage to take in your SA only. Whereas if you're looking down here, 3,000, we know if I'm using a standard, it's definitely going to be cheaper, even if I got to buy a new one. Data center, depending on your discount, it could net out to be neutral and stuff like that. So at a high level, I just wanted to kind of explain how that works. Like I said, in the next webinar, I'm going to go into a lot more depth on how this Azure licensing works. But just to give you an example, if you are doing Windows servers in Azure, bring your own licenses may be more cost advantageous. But you actually have to look at the instance, what you're buying, what the size of that is, what your actual costs are, to figure out if it does or doesn't. as we've been doing this more and more over the last little while, what I would say is that about most clients, if you have SA on standard, it makes sense to take advantage of the Azure hybrid benefit. Data center, it makes sense when you can just not pay for a couple of VMs, but you wouldn't want to just assign data center licenses to VMs in Azure. It doesn't really make much sense. Okay. So I'm going to just pull up real quick here a spreadsheet, just kind of show you how we actually organize our data. And so this was a client that ran MAP. I've kind of masked their server names and things like that. But I just want to show you what we do is we actually line them up. We start with cluster. We go over to host. We look at the device name, what version of Windows is installed on it. We just pull out the addition here for some calculations to make it easier than looking at the long name that you find in there. The device type, so these are all VMs. You can see that there's some virtual machines, which are Hyper-V, and then some physical boxes. And then you start to look at the number of host cores in the host server, the number of procs. vCPUs that this is using is not really relevant in the Windows Server world. That's more relevant for SQL. And that's why this AMD is here, because it was used the same sort of setup for SQL. Is high availability enabled. If HA is on, then we know that we've got server mobility issues. So we may have that information. With this client, we didn't because they ran MAP. But if you provided us with RV tools data, we potentially have that. And so then we just start to go through and look. We'll assign states. So if they're dev servers, we're using MSDN. We'll just knock those out so those don't get counted in licensing. Now, this client here was pretty simple. They had everything under SA, so we just had Windows Standard processors and data center processors. But in here, we might have, Windows 2008 R2 Standard, where we have some entitlements. And so, depending on yours, we might have 5 or 6 license types across the top, where we're going to look at your perpetual licenses. And then we make some notes. So you see here, these guys had a bunch of servers that were retired, that were still in the map data, but had been in the process of being retired. So, they had to license them because they were in use, but they didn't want to renew them because moving forward, they didn't need them. Now, when we look at these things, you're going to always find some things like we see these things over here that are orphans. Orphans are VMs that for whatever reason, the inventory tools couldn't find a home host for them. So, in this case, all of their orphans were retired, but we would assign some licenses to those and just kind of make assumptions that, 2 processors were on the physical box or something like that. Normally, we would try and find homes for them. With this client, we didn't have to because we knew that all these orphans actually were being retired. But when it comes to assigning licenses, what we would do is we'd actually start with a physical box. And we would go and look. Now, the first thing you need to do is look at yourself and say, do I have a program that means that all my licenses need to be in an enterprise or under SA, like the SCE? If that's the case, you can't do what I'm about to talk about. But if you just have these as additional products on your EA, we would go and look and go, do we have any 2008 R2 standard licenses, 2012, even 2003 here, that we can apply to these servers and use our old perpetual license entitlements? And so we would just assign those here, right? And just kind of say, okay, yep, we have those. And, these wouldn't be here. They'd obviously be blanks because they don't have those. But we would just look and assign those first because we want to use those licenses that we have entitlements to, not to use up our more expensive software assurance first. And so then what we would then do is go and look and go, okay, is a server in a cluster? So you see here, this client actually only had 1 cluster. But I would go up here and look at this host, for instance, and go, okay, host 5 is not in a cluster. It has 3 VMs. Here we assign them 2 Windows Standard licenses because we knew that we could stack those licenses and it's less cost effective or more cost effective than Windows Data Center. And so we go through and look at every host server and see what's more cost effective. Is it more cost effective to license the VMs and standard and do stacking? If it's not clustered, we can easily do that. Here, these guys even have some Azure instances. They were licensing those through Azure. Licenses were provided there, so they didn't need to have licenses for that. But they could have potentially used some of their software assurance to cover those off and save some money on these Azure instances. The challenge that they had is they set them up through the portal and we're getting charged for the licenses. And the technical fix to do that is not straightforward. So they're going to be looking at that moving forward. But In this case, they just buying those through Azure. And so in this cluster here, what we did was we actually looked at it and went, okay, this is a cluster. You see, we have one server down here with only one VM currently on it, but we assigned data center to that cluster because the way that these things move on this cluster is they move quite frequently. And at any given time, any of these servers may have 7 or more VMs. And so that was kind of the break-even point. So we went data center here, even though this one host looked like, hey, maybe standard would work, but that was only at, that moment in time. When we looked at their movements, we actually knew that it needed to be data center. So at a real high level, I just kind of wanted to show you, that's how we organize the data. It's a really easy visual way to look at your deployments and figure out, how to assign licenses. We've actually automated this. Our tool that we use, we take in the deployment data, set this up, and then we have formulas where we put in your license costs and your older entitlements and automate, the license assignment, so that's done real quick. Because some bigger clients, I had one where if you went through and did it manually, it'd probably be 8 to 10 hours worth of work. So we've got some tools that automate this. We also look at it in terms now of core licenses. So this client was doing the switch from server proc to core. And so just at a high level to show you what they were thinking, they were all standard licenses before. They were stacking on those hosts that I was showing you on the cluster. We actually recommended that they step up the data center, saved them about $9,000 on the true up because they didn't need those standard servers. We could just step up 4, which they had some extras on. And then they were prepared to renew 560 cores of SA. We kind of said do 264 and 48 of data center based on what they had. So our recommendation was about $600 a year more. But if you sort of look at it, in the first year it was 43,000, 44,000 is what they were going to do, and we'd recommended 35. We put that they weren't compliant. They probably could have proved it. It would have been really tough. We didn't think that they had enough extra standard licenses. Particularly, they were basically just at enough licenses, no excess, when they were going to do their true up at 39. But what ended up happening was when we moved them to data center, we knew they were 100% compliant, and they actually ended up freeing up 248 Windows Standard core licenses. So what's that? Nearly 500 cores that they could choose to either renew or not. And so they saved themselves some money there on future. I think actually they ended up not renewing any. They didn't think they were going to need them. So, but they do have those as entitlements that if they do need a couple servers, they just can't upgrade beyond 2016. So that at a real high level is sort of kind of how we look at this stuff and visualize it. Getting the data out of the map toolkit or the inventory tools is a little bit of a challenge. But if you're interested, we've got a little bit of an offer that we're making. If you want to do an assessment of your Windows server, we'll do it one time for $9,500 to go through and take your deployment information and create an optimized license position, show you where you're at from a processor perspective, and where you're looking from a core perspective. If you want us to add System Center to that, it's just an extra $5,000 for that. We'll use your tools, if you have them. If not, we can use MAP, and we'll create you an optimized license model for processors and cores. We'll get you prepared to ask for the core grants from Microsoft, and help you out there. So if you are interested, either reach out to your sales rep here at Method 180, or you can go to method180.com/windows-server-offer, and there's a e-form there that you can fill out, and one of us will reach out to you. So I think actually I answered the couple of questions. I got a couple of minutes left here. I don't know if there's any other questions, but hopefully this was helpful.
Okay, Mike, this is Sean. So what I'll do is I've just got a few housekeeping things to take care of. So why don't I do that? And if anyone has any questions, now is the opportunity to submit them, and Mike can address them. So as Mike kind of alluded to, our next webinar is going to be on Azure 101. So that's going to be on July 20th. So we'll be sending out invitations to that shortly. And as usual, we have recorded the session today, and the emails will go out to you with the links to the recording and to the slide deck in the next few days. And it'll also be available, if for whatever reason you don't see that, it will also be available the next few days on method180.com. If you go into our blog area, it should be the top post there once it goes live. So it doesn't appear that we have any questions, Mike. I think you've done a great job of answering them kind of as they came in.
Excellent. Well, thanks everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon.